Welcome to the Divorce Podcast, where we explore all aspects of ending relationships, separation, and parenting apart. If your marriage or partnership has ended, or you have friends and family who are separating, this podcast is for you. I'm Kate Daly, a relationship counsellor, divorce specialist, and co-founder of Amicable, the online legal service for separating couples. In each episode, we look at relationships and separation from different angles, including the emotional, legal, and social. I'm joined by experts and special guests who share their own unique stories, experience, and tips with the goal of helping people end relationships in a kinder and better way. In this episode, I was joined by Louise, a certified financial planner with over 30 years' experience, to discuss the recent budget announcement and how it will affect divorcing couples at different stages of the process. We start off by summarising the main headlines from the announcement, and then we go on to explore in detail how CGT, increased stamp duty on second homes, tax on the sale of businesses, increased VAT on private schools, and changes to the rules on inheriting pensions affect divorcing couples and their children. We finish off by giving tips on how to manage the anxiety that comes with financial changes by seeking timely advice, as well as having important conversations about changes at an early stage in the divorce process. If you loved this episode, then please subscribe and rate us on your preferred listening platform. Welcome again, Lou. It's lovely to have you.
It's lovely to be here, Kate. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Now, this is a bit of a budget special, isn't it? So we've had the anticipation, as you were just saying to me earlier, the much anticipated budget. It feels like there's been a long time between the government coming to power and then delivering this budget. So it's had plenty of time to get lots of anxiety airtime. And I think, as you were saying, lots of people watch the budget on Wednesday and they might be thinking, well, what does this actually mean for me? And if you're going through a divorce or a separation, it might be quite important to get some advice and to reevaluate some of the things you've been thinking about. So, Luke, give us an overview then of just high level, and we'll come back and we'll talk about each of them individually, but give us a list of the key things that will affect divorcing couples from the budget.
Yeah, so there are quite a few areas that divorcing couples should think about, and to just take a breath, rethink, take some advice. The headliners are, and we knew it was coming, capital gains tax. There's been changes in capital gains tax, and the increase has been on the side of shares, not property, but I will come to that. We've got an increase in respect of stamp duty for second homes, up to 5% instead of 3%. Need to be careful of that rule, especially if you're buying a property and moving out of a principal private residence. Come back to that. Of course, we knew this was coming as well, VAT on school fees from January. There is a case going forward. Schools are putting together a defence against that. However, let's assume it's coming in. So I'll come back to that. So that's 20% extra. Business asset disposal relief. So if you have a business as a couple, this is key because this will affect potentially the net value of the proceeds of the sale. So that's one to watch. And maybe one that's not immediately an issue, but with pensions, the knockdown on inheritance, so beneficiaries' pensions, is likely to go 2027. And there's a consultation paper over the next 3 months with the pension providers to get that into place. But that's just sort of a longer term consideration, but it's one to put in the mix, really. So those are the main changes, and we'll come back to how they might affect divorcing couples.
Okay. So the key point here then really is you might be listening to this and be in the middle of your divorce, in which case, if any of those things are going to be impactful, you might have to go back and renegotiate or relook at the impact that has. You might be considering a divorce, and therefore some of those changes are immediate and some of those changes aren't coming in until a later point in time. So that might impact, the timing of this for people as well. And there might be people who are have got a consent order into the court and are expecting one outcome, but actually there's going to be a different outcome because irrespective of what you've already put to the court, you might not be getting out of a settlement what you think you're getting out of it. So there are different groups of people who will be affected by this, it sounds. But the key point feels like you need to go and get some advice. Speak to a financial advisor, speak to somebody who can take you through your individual circumstances and what the impact of the budget will be on you as an individual. Or if you're doing it as a couple, getting some couples advice and working through what's going to happen and what the changes to your circumstances are going to be. So it sounds like there's quite a few things that potentially impact divorcing couples. Let's go back to your list then. CGT, tell us about the changes in CGT. First of all, just briefly, what is CGT?
Yeah, so capital gains tax. So you pay capital gains tax when you've made a profit on an asset. So typically that might be a stocks and shares portfolio that's not held within an ISA or a tax wrapper that shelters it. And it would be a property. So a second property, so not your principal private residence. I'll come back to that. You can get trapped with it when you're divorcing. But if you buy a second property, then, and you make a profit on that, you can offset items that you've spent. You might have ripped out the kitchen and the bathroom, and those sort of items potentially can be offset against the gain. But that's when you would be suffering capital gains tax. So for second homes, we thought it was going to go up. We were all sat on the edge of our seats. There was clients trying to sell properties before the budget day. I'm sure that you had that. But actually for higher rate tax, it remained at 24%. And it's a bit less for basic rate taxpayers, but it actually stayed the same. But the stamp duty on purchase went up on a second property.
Right. Well, let's come back to that because we're talking about CGT at the moment. So on CGT went up from what to what?
So on stocks and shares, then the high rate went up to 24%. So it would have been 18% and it went up to 24% for high rate taxpayers. And it was 10% and we're now 18% for basic rate taxpayers. So it's quite a considerable increase for capital gains. And we only have a £3,000 annual allowance to use, which is really small.
Because that went down, didn't it, in a previous budget? So we've got a small allowance. We've got greater tax on any profit you make on selling stocks and shares. And is it just stocks and shares, or what other items might fall under CGT?
Well, you've got business assets as well. And we'll come on to that because the business assets relief has changed as well. That's gone up. So anything that you might make a profit on, you could be attributable to capital gains tax. Might be an antique furniture or jewelry, paintings,
wine,
sort of
anything
things.
Like that.
Certain types of wine are exempt. The sort you don't drink, Kate, that you just keep. There's really expensive French ones. So there are exemptions to CGT, but basically, if you make a profit on something, you might fall foul of CGT. So just check it.
All right. And so let's move on then. So is there anything else on capital gains, or let's move on to the next one?
I think just one area to be careful of. So divorcing couples usually have a principal private residence. And it might be that one person moves out of that property.
So we're talking about the family home here, aren't we? Principal primary residence is the tax term for it. But for normal people, it's our home. So our normal home where we live.
Yeah, the family home. So at the minute, between spouses, you have this no gain, no loss transfer. So you can transfer assets to your spouse without triggering off a capital gain. Now, there is a window. So it's the last day of the third tax year after separation, or when the couple cease living together. You have that time frame to transfer assets without triggering off a potential capital gain. So it's really important to consider what the date is of separation or when you cease living together. And I know you must come across this all the time, Kate, but just be careful of that because you don't want to end up paying capital gains tax on your principal private residence.
Yes. So that, and to be fair to the government, or government I use in the generalist term because it was probably a different government, that has changed as well, because it used to be a really short timescale, didn't it? About 9 months, and it was trapping lots of people in the divorcing situation where, if you're separating, you can easily, go over the 9-month threshold. But we've got 3 years now effectively to separate and sort out assets transferring before there's a hit a tax hit. That's essentially what's changed, isn't it?
It's a lot better than it was. It really is. But it's just one to be aware of, really, because there are some divorces that do drag on. And if you're not aware of that particular rule, then you could fall foul of it.
Yeah, and that brings up the other point that I think you mentioned, which is this notion of the stamp duty land tax on second homes, because that's changed, hasn't it? And again, that's something that comes up in divorce, because sometimes for the cash flow and the timing of holding on to the family home, but then one of you purchasing another property can leave one of you holding effectively two properties for a while and then having to pay the additional stamp duty land tax. And that becomes, although you can get a refund for it, it's a cash flow issue ultimately, isn't it? You've got to pay it at the time it happens and then claim it back. So that can be a really tricky one when finances are really tight. Do you want to just unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, and the numbers are really stark. So I ran some numbers this morning. So if you're buying a property and it's going to be your principal private residence, the stamp duty, say you buy a property at 500,000, just to give you an example, the stamp duty on that is 12,500 if it was going to be your home, your main home. And under the new rules, if that is deemed to be a second property because of the timing issue, you're looking at 37,500. It's
Wow,
massive.
that's huge.
It's huge.
Yeah.
And also you have a window in which to sell your principal private residence, your home, in order to have a refund, and it's 3 years. And the way the property market is at the minute, it's just one to be really careful of, because you might end up not getting a refund on the purchase of that deemed second property. You might end up stuck with it. So it's just be careful, really.
And I'm just going to allay any panic as well at the moment too, because if you have what's called a Mesher style order when you divorce, that's where you've made an agreement for one of you to stay in the home with the children, and then you're not selling the property till a lot later. It can sometimes be up to 10 years later when both children have, or all children have finished full-time secondary education. That doesn't trigger the same tax treatment as just doing this without the Mesher order. The Mesher order is there to protect you against that scenario. But again, I should have said at the beginning of this, neither of us are giving individual legal or tax advice on this. So you must check this out with a qualified tax or IFA professional on an individual basis. These are just some things to watch out for and be aware of at this point.
They are. So the other one, Kate, is the business.
Tell us about that, Lou.
Yeah. So it used to be called Entrepreneurs Relief. It's now called Business Asset Disposal Relief. So quite often the couples that we're working with are running a business, or they have shares in a business, and therefore you would need to get a value of that business. For divorce purposes, sometimes people need to go to the extent of getting a forensic valuation on their business to get underneath what that might be. Now, Entrepreneurs Relief has actually gone down and down over the years. And at the minute, there is relief up to £1 million, and the rate you pay is 10%. So that's taken into consideration when you're valuing a business, because whoever ends up with that will still have to pay that when they exit the business. Now that's going up, it's phased, so it's frozen at 10% for this year, for this tax year, and then it's going to go up to, I've got the figures here, it's going up to 14% in 25 and 18% in 26. So actually it's really the same principle, that the value of that asset, depending on when it will be sold, will be less.
And people need to factor this in, don't they, if they're thinking about, if they're separated and not too worried about sorting out the finances in the long term. Because we often get that, don't we, where people want to separate first, get used to being separated before they start to then tackle financial decisions. And that might be absolutely the right thing to do still. But it's just bearing in mind that waiting at this point may be having financial consequences, and really trying to get underneath what that might mean for you in your particular circumstances.
Yeah. And I suppose the downside of this, Kate, is that it encourages people to rush decisions. So you sell the business before April, then you've got the 10%. And that's not a good thing, because decisions made in haste usually potentially aren't the right ones. And we're finding people are letting the tax tail wag the dog, and it's bigger than that. So yeah, that's the downside of this sort of phased, you've got a window at 10%, etc. So again, it's take a breath. What's important? Look at the big picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got to make all of these decisions when you're divorcing and separating in the context of other people, not just yourself. It's not just an individual decision. It's a collective and collaborative decision very often as well, isn't it? So, yeah, I totally understand that. So that's business relief. What else?
We've got VAT on school fees coming in January.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So we've known about that for a while, haven't we? And I guess this has been impacting probably lots of families for quite a while. It's one of the things that people worry about a great deal when you're getting divorced and separated. Usually, the first thought is for the children and trying to keep things as stable as possible for children. And the impact of an extra 20% on fees if you're paying school fees is going to be really tough for some
Yeah, it's
families, isn't it?
massive. And we work with families, as you can imagine, who have been worried about this issue for a while. And what we're doing is we're going back to the numbers to see whether it's still workable for them to keep the kids in the schools. And we're looking to, this is a bit wider than this, but it can help in divorce as well. We're looking to the wider sort of family unit as well. Considering, are there grandparents, for example, that might be looking at doing some tax planning that could potentially help with the extra VAT. So sometimes there are other ways of looking at it in the round. How that impacts when you're going through a divorce, Kate, maybe you could come to that because it could have sort of connotations. But what I would say is just look at the numbers, because you will need to be thinking about your needs. And if your needs have increased because of the VAT on the school fees, it's important to have a look at that and refresh it. And then also to decide who is going to pay the school fees, what proportion, is it half each, or how does that work? Yeah, that's a sensible thing to do.
Yes, definitely. And again, these are things where it depends on how you've made your arrangements as well. There could be people who have done an informal arrangement around school fees previously, so it's not documented in their consent order. There might be people who are sitting here thinking, like, I agreed to pay for them, but I now cannot afford to pay for them. And that requires a conversation. So all of this, I think it's very tempting when you're feeling quite frightened by some of these financial consequences, going quite hard and strong and to use language that might be quite definitive. But I would say to people, this is about you need to try and create a conversation, and just opening up the door to having a conversation. Can we talk about, I've been really worried about, is much better than, I can't afford the school fees now, there's VAT on them, I'm going to stop paying. You can just sense the difference, and just actually being a little bit more placating and appreciative of how the other person's going to feel about some of these conversations is really
And
key.
ultimately the effect on the children as well, because not only are they going through difficult
Absolutely,
times
yeah.
because their parents are separating or divorcing, it's also unsettling to move them away from that school.
Yeah.
This is why it's good to think about, is there a way of doing it, bringing in the wider family, etc.
Yeah, and that's stuff that kids will have heard this stuff in the background, because we've been talking about this for such a long time. It's been in the news, it's been all over the internet. So kids will have picked stuff up potentially, and they may be harboring quite deep-seated worries. So actually broaching this with your kids and including the children in a conversation to say, we are working on sorting this out and we will come to you as soon as we can. Our preference might be X, Y, or Z, but we are, as a parenting team, working together to get a good result here. I think that can be as reassuring as it can get for kids, just knowing that both parents are committed to trying to find a resolution to it, even if you haven't got the answers at the moment. But just thinking that saying nothing, and if they're not mentioning it, it's all okay, that's where it's not quite right. Kids do pick up on this stuff.
Yeah, it's not healthy, is it?
No, exactly.
Communication is the key.
As we know.
Yeah, absolutely. So what else do we have? We have potential changes to pensions in 2027. I mean, pensions are a big consideration when you're going through a divorce or a separation, and it's getting a value on those is important, and looking to the future, and don't just look at the present, as because some people might ignore the pension because they want the house, for example. But it's looking at it, looking at the future. What does it look like? And it's important to have a retirement provision as well as a roof over your head, if possible. So these changes is a consultation paper over the next 3 months. and they're looking at inherited pensions. So at the minute, you can pass your pension down to your kids, potentially, which is rather nice to do that. And that rule looks like it's going because people are using their pensions for inheritance tax planning and they're designed for retirement income. Whether you agree with that or not, that's the way that it looks like it's going. So a pension will form part of your estate. This is on second death. Now, why is this important to divorcing couples? Well, it may be that you are looking at splitting your assets and you may say, actually, it's okay, you have the pension because I know ultimately you're going to leave whatever's left to the kids. I mean, you might have a couple who are in their retirement, for example. So they might be thinking about what happens when they die. We know that couples get divorced, when they're silver divorces or whatever the term is.
Silver splitters,
Silver splitters. So it's really important for people like that to think, actually, I can no longer pass this down inheritance tax free, potentially to the next generation. So therefore, how do we split the assets? And it may be a consideration as to whether that asset is split or not, whatever. So I think it's coming in, but we don't know the detail, but it's just something to bear in mind, really.
Yeah, and like you say, there will be lots of people who legitimately have made a plan to put quite a bit of money into a pension on exactly that basis and that premise. And it is really, that's why it's so important, whatever agreements you come to, is to make sure you have all of this properly documented in a consent order that ultimately has a clean break as well. Because when you've got blended families and you've got new families, if you're splitting up earlier and you go on to have a new family and you've got lots of different children from different marriages, all of the tax rules and the laws around what you can and can't pass down and to who and what you pay for doing that and who can claim if they don't like the decision you've made in your will, it all becomes incredibly messy. So it's really important to take some proper advice on this. And as you say, to do the tax planning, you can still do your tax planning as a couple, but as a divorcing couple, can't you, as well? And that's really important. And the importance of having some good quality information, maybe an actuarial report, or I know you've done some brilliant cash flow modeling in the past for some of our customers, Lou, as well. So understanding whether or not a settlement is going to work, not just now, but in the future, is really critical, particularly if there are significant assets in pension and a lot of the settlement is predicated on splitting pensions and that kind of things, because you often find there can be gaps at a certain point that you need to bridge and you need to think of different ways of bridging. So.
Yeah, that's right. Seeking advice as a couple is really important because these assets will be either joint owned or half each, and the tax implications and the planning that you can do as a couple to use allowances you might need to transfer from one to the other can be really creative. So that communication is really important. Ultimately, it might save you money. And at the best, it takes away the fear because once you know your numbers, you're less fearful. There's, just to say, there's nothing to be fearful or concerned or majorly worried about, particularly this budget. It is what it is. There's a little bit more tax, but you can play around the edges and there is planning to be done. So just seek advice.
Sounds good advice. So was there anything else in the budget that we need to think about from a divorce perspective?
I think those are the key things, really. It's the same message. Understand your numbers. It'll take away the fear and you'll be empowered, which is a good position to be in.
Exactly. I mean, that's certainly the key thing for working through a divorce. It feels very overwhelming at the beginning, and it is overwhelming at the beginning. But once you start, it's like anything, once you start to get into it and you start to have a method and a process, and like you say, you start to understand the numbers, it gives you that empowerment. It enables you to make decisions and it allows you to feel that you've leveled the playing field as well, and that you're actually not negotiating with one hand tied behind your back, but you're actually there meeting your other parent or counterpart on an equal level. And it's so useful. I love it when people actually go and get some proper advice and they come back into our process and they're just like different people, and you can be more creative when you understand the situation better and you don't feel like your back's against the wall.
Totally. And couples during their marriages should talk about money. They're probably less likely to get divorced if they do. So be open about it. If things are difficult, share the difficulties rather than hide it, and be open with the children as well. And because the children they form their relationships at a very young age, with regards to men. I think it's the age of 7. So it's back to communication. And however hard it is, the conversation, you feel a whole lot better when you've had the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, that was a really great run through the budget. Thank you very much indeed, Lou. Appreciate your time today. Any final tips for people?
Don't worry too much, because that doesn't really help. And seek advice. Get your ducks in a row. Make a list of all of the assets that you have as a couple. It will help you, Kate, and the team as well. Get values and see and consider which of those assets might be sat on a taxable gain, and then seek advice from there.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And Lou, if people want to seek advice from you, particularly, where can they find you?
So they can find me at piercefieldoliver.com, or if you just put Louise Oliver into Google, you'll find me.
Fantastic. And of course, you can find us at amicable.co.uk. You can subscribe and listen to the podcast on your favourite listening platforms, or thedivorcepodcast.com. Thanks, everybody, for listening. I hope you've enjoyed our budget special, and thank you especially, Lou, for joining me again today.
Thanks, Kate.